Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? Hopefully had a good evening last night, and thanks for coming back for round 2 today. And today we're going to have a little bit of a difference with some talks and also some panels. And so we're hoping that our panelists will be able to share some of their work and also to engage in some conversation, and then we'll bring you as audience members into that conversation. So we'll hear from them first. I'll do some moderated questions and discussion, and then we'll turn to audience members. So that'll be the flow for today. If you don't know me from yesterday, my name is Simona Capizani. I'm an assistant professor at Durham University and one of the co-organizers of the event. And I'm really excited to have our 3 panelists here in discussion. And so I'll briefly introduce all of you, and then when you speak, you're able to introduce yourself. So we have Deborah McGregor, who's a law professor at York University. And then we have Jenny Stevens, who's joining us. She's the Dean of Professor of Sustainability, Science, and Policy at Northeastern. And then Annie Steltz, who's coming from the Center for Human Values at Princeton University. So with that, we're going to have Annie and then Deborah and Jenny speak. So you have about 8 to 10 minutes, and Annie, I'll just let you take it away.
Great. Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me to the conference. I've really enjoyed it. I'm one of the folks here who's new to the topic of geoengineering. This has not been a focus of my work in the past. But I have written on issues of global justice and territorial sovereignty and political legitimacy. And those topics are salient, I think, in the debates around these issues. So there's a lot of concern that one individual or one country or maybe one corporation might decide to deploy something like solar radiation management. And that kind of a decision would be unilateral. And for that reason, I think it would also be politically illegitimate. So to express the intuitive kind of objection that I think a lot of people would have to that sort of thing, we might say to that person or country who unilaterally deployed the technology, who made you boss of the entire world? So in that kind of a scenario, the decision makers would not be elected by Earth dwellers. They wouldn't be authorized by any treaty or by any kind of representative process. And so I think would-be unilateral geoengineers would commit a wrong that is similar to the wrong of autocratic rule or the wrong of colonialism. They would rule other people, govern them without their input. Now, we might try to distinguish between the legitimacy of a decision to deploy SRM and the legitimacy of a decision to research it. Now, you might think, or you might object, that a decision to research it might not need to be subject to such stringent procedural legitimacy standards. So just launching a weather balloon to run a few tests like the recently canceled ScopeX project would have done doesn't necessarily pose a real risk of harm to anyone, so why subject that kind of a decision to such demanding scrutiny? And I think one thing we might say in reply is that the decision to research SRM makes it much more likely that the technology will be deployed and that it will eventually be deployed unilaterally, because we don't yet have a legitimate world representative framework under which a decision whether or not to deploy it could be made. So one principle of legitimate decision-making about SRM seems to me to be the following. Any legitimate decision to research solar geo must be tied to a simultaneous decision to build the global institutions that might be able to legitimately govern its deployment. If we don't create the governance infrastructure, then we should not engage in SRM research. Otherwise, we make it very likely that the illegitimate unilateral deployment of the technology will eventually occur. So what kind of global body might be able to legitimately decide whether or not to engage in SRM? Well, that's really difficult. Let me just venture some tentative ideas about it. So first, I don't think that a legitimate decision-making process should take a purely majoritarian form. By that, I mean that we shouldn't take a decision whether or not to deploy SRM in a global one-person, one-vote referendum, for example, or by elected representatives who are accountable to a unified demos of humanity as a whole. And I see 2 reasons why we shouldn't do that. So first, geoengineering might create large concentrated harms to the vital interests of some specific groups of people on the planet. There are a number of risks of harmful impacts, as I understand it. The technology could negatively impact plant photosynthesis. It could significantly lessen rainfall in certain parts of the world. So we might face a situation in which solar geoengineering could benefit most people around the globe by reducing global temperatures, but it would also impose very severe costs on some specific groups of people by destroying agriculture in their countries or severely harming their ecosystems. And so, like many other people with rights-based sympathies, I don't think it's okay to impose large, concentrated harms on specific groups of people for the sake of moderate aggregate benefits that are spread across a larger group. So since not everybody will necessarily benefit from geoengineering, we haven't really given them a justification that says why they should accept these harms, accept sacrifices of their vital interests for the sake of benefits to others. So I worry that a global majoritarian vote on SRM might create a scenario of global tyranny of the majority, in which a majority of people vote for solar geo because it would benefit them, and they ignore the cost that it might impose on minority groups. So just like standard liberal constitutions contain rights protections for the basic rights of minorities, I think that a legitimate global decision procedure should not allow SRM if it might compromise minorities' vital interests. And so that means that a condition of any legitimate decision is that it needs to occur within a framework of constitutional rights protections. Either no harm to people's vital interests should occur, or compensating measures should be taken with minority participation to safeguard their vital interests against those possible negative impacts. So a second principle of legitimacy, I think, is that solar engineering should not be deployed if it would create large uncompensated harms to the vital interests of global minorities. And an additional reason I think why we shouldn't have just global majoritarian decision-making about SRM is that people have interests not just as individuals, but also as members of self-determining communities that bear on the decision whether or not to deploy this technology. So people have interests as members of cultural groups in using specific areas of land for the social practices that matter to them. And they also have interests in being politically self-determining, in governing themselves through their own institutions, and having the sovereignty of those institutions recognized. So a decision to engage in SRM needs to respect people's rights to cultural and political self-determination, and that applies not just to already recognized sovereign states, but also to indigenous peoples and other kinds of internally autonomous sub-state minorities. So right now, international governance generally tries to respect self-determination by requiring state consent to international treaties. In my view, that's not the best mechanism for operationalizing respect for collective self-determination. So first of all, states are not always the best representatives of their people's self-determination, especially when they contain oppressed internal minorities. So in those cases, it might be better for those sub-state minorities to have their own representatives at international negotiations, especially if they have a bad history with their state. And second, I think requiring the consent of every self-determining people is too demanding. So we might think of an extremely dire future scenario in which recourse to SRM is the only way to stave off grave climate impacts that would threaten the basic rights of a majority of humanity or create grave social harms. And we might imagine that all the world's self-determining peoples except one support the deployment of this technology. And the one people is opposed not because the technology would threaten their vital interests, but out of animus. So I think to allow that group to unilaterally veto the policy would give them a disproportionate amount of power over the lives of other Earth dwellers. So while I think that global governance of this technology should be designed to reflect legitimate group interests and the differences of their perspectives and position, I don't think we should give every group a veto. I think instead what we might do is to require a qualified majority of the world's self-determining peoples for any legitimate decision to deploy SRM. So we might think of the qualifications as follows. We could require supermajority support of the world's peoples for a decision that would be as dramatic and irreversible as this one. We might also require that the support take a certain form. For example, that it contain a majority of countries from the global south and a majority of the world's indigenous peoples in order to protect against the hegemony and domination of countries in the global north. So my tentative proposal has 3 parts. I think first, any legitimate governance process should ensure that Earth dwellers' vital interests to subsistence, security, and a livable environment are protected. Second, I think it would require a qualified majority of representatives of the world's peoples to vote to deploy SRM. And third, I think it should tie public support for any further research into the technology to the simultaneous development of these kinds of representative institutions. That's it.
Okay. Am I close enough?
You probably have to have it a little bit
Okay. Look at my big.
on this side. Is that okay for you?
Sure. All right. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully the walk here or whatever woke you up. Thank you, Annie, for that. A lot of food for thought. Thank you for the land acknowledgement yesterday and the brains who organized this. So, and when we spoke yesterday, I learned a lot from that because, like Annie, this isn't necessarily my field, but there is, a lens that I approach it from. And I realized during COP27 there was an interesting story on CBC that was actually dealing with this topic, but they didn't exactly use the same terminology, but it's kind of what it was. But I remember being kind of alarmed from the lens that I would bring to this because of underlying assumptions that I'll talk about. So I wanted to approach this. I tried to apply some sort of logic to it because there's so much to say, and of course you want to encourage discussion with you. Is where I see, I guess starting off with what I heard in that particular story and my thinking around it, where I think there's knowledge gaps, because I think people talked about this yesterday, but being involved in climate assessments, part of the IPCC report that came out as a contributing author for various sections, and then for the first time in the Canadian context, a standalone Indigenous climate report. U.S. has been doing it for a while with tribes, but now Canada finally did that, and there's huge knowledge gaps in terms of what we know and then what we're making decisions on, basically not knowing certain things. And then sort of what the First Nation climate lens is, and then I'll try to summarize sort of my thoughts around this. So I'm an Anishinaabe person from the Great Lakes and a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice, so it's the sort of thing I think about all the time and also live it, so it's not just so abstract and conceptual for me. And what I'll point to is just a couple of committees that I find myself. One is for the Assembly of First Nations, their Environment and Climate Change Committee, so you just sort of get insights in terms of where governments are thinking and what they understand to be solutions. And I'm also part of the Canadian Climate Institute, which tries to focus on what climate solutions are. And I'm on the adaptation panel as opposed to the mitigation panel, but still I find the issues are similar and sort of what it's sort of to make me think about. And again, this whole idea of like knowledge gaps, like what we don't know and how alarmed I get when people make decisions based on basically, we know enough to know we need to do something, but I don't think we're as imaginative and creative about solutions as we could be if we had a broader base of knowledge and listen to folks that we need to, as others yesterday and today have pointed out. So this climate change story, so I liked how yesterday started. I like stories. That's kind of how I think. When I think about my ancestral or traditional stories, now I kind of look at them with a climate lens. They were telling us about climate, like they were telling us how to behave properly when we confront these kind of challenges. But in this episode, and if you're really interested, I mean, I could let the brains know and they could share it with you. They were talking about the climate repair, and I haven't got the terminology quite right because I tend to work in the mitigation, resilience, like that sort of realm, how the silos already exist within the APCC type of assessment framework. But they were calling it climate repair. And one fellow from Wales was basically making an ice-making machine to try to re-ice sea ice, I guess, in the north. And I guess the idea is also to offset carbon credits elsewhere, like it's not just being benevolent per se. But what was interesting about the conversation with Matt Galloway, who's the host for the CBC program, The Current, he knows enough to ask, does anybody in the north actually want this? Have you talked to people, like Indigenous peoples who primarily tend to be in the north? And they're like, no, we haven't yet. So, and I thought, well, it's, to me, the discomfort came, and it's because of other experiences that I've had that there's just this assumption that, of course, they're going to love it. Of course, this is absolutely what they want. This is what they think the solution is. But you haven't talked to people about it. You just assume that. So there's an arrogance, and I just call it the development perspective. If only we can get these people developed and on board with this thing, things will be great. We'll be able to re-ice your whatever. Not even knowing that maybe there's some other goals, like the northern sovereignty, there's lots of issues, other issues kind of going on in the north. So I thought, wow, that's pretty bizarre. And the other one, so they did talk about the SRM issue with the Sami and in Sweden. They talked about that one as well, and the Sami resistance and others to that. Then there was the whale poop one. This was the one that kind of blew me away, but not in a good way. And that was wanting to make whale poo, because baleen whales make this poo that I guess is a carbon sink or something. So humans think they can make the whale poo, and I thought maybe we should focus on trying to save the baleen whales so they can make their own poo, because they'll probably do it better than us. So I saw, like to me that was like that arrogance again, like that humans think that they can interfere with nature in this way and do nature better than nature does. So that was like totally bizarre to me, but these are real things. So there was the issue of thinking about, and again, the same question was asked, have you actually talked to Inuit people in the north or northern people to see if this is like their thing? That hasn't happened yet. So again, you have these solutions being generated, and it sounded like, and I don't know, but white men, on Indigenous peoples and northern people, and then trying to convince them that these are all great ideas. And I remember thinking to myself, because I work in the research realm, as we all do, and you probably could eventually get someone to buy into it after some effort, right? So I thought, in probably 10 years, there probably would be someone investing in this ice-making machine or whale poo project, whatever it is. So to me, I saw there was inherent biases around human-nature relationships playing out in this whole scenario that I found disturbing. This development perspective that still persists, that always really makes me uncomfortable, because it assumes Indigenous people can't possibly think of solutions based on their own knowledge. And a lot of these, so colonialism is still part of this, and that if you don't really address colonialism, you probably will recolonize. So in some way. So hopefully that made sense. So I didn't get at all the underlying assumptions, but those are the ones that sort of sent the alarm bells ringing in my head. So the climate change lens. So the Assembly of First Nations, which is sort of the national body that represents First Nations in Canada, developed a climate lens, because as usual, you're involved in climate policy after the fact. That's also been my experience with the assessment processes. I think it was the summer of 2021. A number of us were asked to put together impacts of climate change on Indigenous people in Canada, Mexico, and the US in like 3 weeks. And the report came out, I think, in February of 2022. So not a lot of time. And there went my summer. So it was very, so you're always kind of asked after the fact. You're always catching up. You're trying to catch up to what everybody else is. Okay, they had years to do this, and now I have like weeks. So they developed a climate change lens. How are we going to look at solutions or policies or laws and assess based on like what's important to us as First Nations people? And so there was recognition that there's a broader context, international protocols, as well, and UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in the Canadian context, constitutional rights for Indigenous peoples, and treaties, and that there's an Indigenous lived reality about how we experience climate change. So as I found myself in these circles, I'll call them, it's very siloed. Like, I'm on the adaptation and we don't talk about mitigation. And the mitigation people, I'm pretty sure, are told not to talk about adaptation. And then there's the monitoring, and then there's risk and vulnerability. And like, there's just all these silos. But that's not how we experience climate change. Probably none of us do, but certainly not Indigenous people when you're on the land. You're not experiencing it in these cute little silos, but researchers come in and research based on these silos, and that then becomes the scholarship and body of knowledge around Indigenous peoples and climate change. So that's not the lived reality in terms of how people experience this and how people are resilient to this. So that was one part of the lens. The other part is the recognition of Indigenous knowledge, and that Indigenous peoples, as others have pointed out, are generally vulnerable along with others in the world, but at the same time, you also bring knowledge and strength to the question. So I think about in my own experience, so probably, I'm pretty sure the same here. Genocidal policies towards Indigenous peoples, displacement, dispossession, oppression, you name it, happened. But here we are. We've managed to survive dramatic change, environmental and climatic change due to relocation and everything else, political, economic upheaval, but here we are. I can still say I'm part of the Anishinaabe Nation, despite all of that. So we actually kind of know some things about how to survive, what everybody else is now starting to face. So maybe, talk to us about what those might be. So there's this, so there's always that ongoing tension. At the same time, you're like, oh, people are talking about me as being vulnerable again. But I also know there's strength and knowledge in our own laws and our own ways of living with the land. So there's this tension that we're always trying to negotiate. Because colonialism is part of our reality, you also have to talk about decolonization. So when I hear colonialism, I'm like, not good enough. You have to talk about decolonization. And yesterday, presentation, the last one, Holly's, I think, she talked about decarbonization. I call it like the C word. Like, we always talk about carbon and decarbonization. To me, you can't talk about that unless you're going to talk about decolonization at all kinds of different scales. And it turns out that decarbonization isn't producing the results that we need to have sooner than later, obviously. So to me, those can't be uncoupled. The other C words, of course, are capitalism and colonialism. I call them the other C words, and people get really upset about that in a lot of these spaces that I'm in. You don't want to hear about those other words. So the knowledge gap. Sorry, I'll just be a few minutes here. I was trying to be really organized and just tell you what I wanted to contribute, but there'll be more time for conversation. So I'll call them the knowledge gaps, but it's also a problem in terms of how we even understand what knowledge is and who has it. And others have talked about it here already. But what I did want to point to is it was a report that came out. And again, it's the kind of thing I can find for you and send to the brains, and they could share with you. And what they did was they assessed 1,000 top scientists. This was Reuters' hot list. And so these are the most influential climate scientists. So what they found is, so they based this on publication records, social media presence, is that they were only, it was a dominance to the global north. There was only 5 African scientists in total that were on that list, and only 122 women. As far as I know, no Indigenous people. Primarily dominated. It actually surprised me by Europe, more so than the United States. I thought it would be the US first, so they analyzed it also geographically. So that's a huge bias in terms of who gets to ask the questions, who's going to get funding, what kind of research is going to get funded, in terms of this huge bias, and who's not part of that conversation. And for Indigenous peoples and others, you're on the outside looking in. So there's very much a gendered element to this as well. The other, this isn't even me going on about Indigenous knowledge, I can talk about that another time, is another report that came out, Overland in 2021, I think it was. They looked at mitigation funding over the last 50 years. And it's was close to like 780, almost 800% more for the science and technology, exclusion of social science and especially the humanities. Like this conversation would not have been part of that mitigation over the last 50 years. So that has huge implications to me for SRM, because these conversations aren't happening to sort of guide how we even ask the questions, how we want to research those questions, who should be involved. So anyway, so I'll stop there because there's a lot more to say. But to me, it's always look around and like see who's like not there, right? Like if they're not there, there's a big problem. So human nature relationships. So I was really struck yesterday because by the 1% image that you had put up, because what came to my mind was what we know, or this comes out of the United Nations, is that Indigenous peoples caretake about 20% of the Earth's landmass, but that's where 80% of the biodiversity is, and that's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. So there's something there. People are trying to figure out, like, what's the mechanism? Indigenous peoples know, but researchers, scientists don't know. So there's a different ontology and experience and knowledge happening there. And then I juxtaposition that with the 1%. And I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do about that, but it sort of kind of blew me away. So for us, a lot of our solutions are land-based. So what enabled, like me to be here, my ancestors to survive, is because our relationship to the land. It wasn't other people's solutions. We actually had a big commission and report on that, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, that said other people's solutions for us don't work. They make things worse. So it was our own traditions and our own knowledge and our own ways of being that enabled us to survive. So the land is central to what we understand to be solutions and how to move forward. So I'll just end here because it was just, again, building upon sort of what I heard yesterday and sort of the end of that story that was part of the current on climate repair. Was one of the fundamental questions was, what do we consider to be broken? And from an Indigenous perspective, it's our relationship to the earth that's broken. And I think that was spoken about yesterday in the declaration out of the Turtle Lodge out of Manitoba. So that's sort of like the root issue that as Indigenous peoples understand it, our relationship to the natural world. But it's also not hopeless, because it's really easy to work in this space and just go, like, it is not good. The disaster reports come out every year and it's not good, right? Like you just, and so, but in this, but humanity also has the capacity for creativity. We can be super smart, but there's also hope in our humanity for imaginative solutions that can work, that actually respect nature rather than trying to replicate it. Because I don't think there's other scenarios over time where people have tried to do that, and it really hasn't worked out that well. It kind of reminds me, yesterday when I was hearing some of the talks was, maybe some of you're not as old as me, but if you remember there was an old lady who swallowed the fly, and then she keeps swallowing things to keep trying to deal with the original thing. That's what it seems like to me, is how we're approaching climate solutions. So just, I guess, some insights is there's huge biases that I can see in the work that I do, just trying to find that, because we have to use a peer-reviewed literature for these assessments. You just can't find certain knowledge there because people didn't ask the right questions 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. We're just asking them now. We don't have that body of knowledge yet to really be imaginative and hopeful. And that we need to think about the people who are on the outside looking in, what's actually broken, and how we can start thinking in, I guess, more hopeful ways, because young people and future generations are not inheriting a planet they're necessarily happy to be in. So we need to sort of think more creatively, I think, about what we want to offer the world. So that took a little bit longer. Apologies to my panelists, and thank you for listening.
Great. Well, thank you. I just do have a few slides just to organize my thoughts. And I want to follow up, actually, directly with what Deborah just mentioned in terms of focusing on asking the right questions. And I think we are here today focused on one topic, but I think we really need to broaden the contextualize it. So I want to suggest that we're asking the wrong questions because we're framing the problem in the wrong way. That climate change is not the problem. And this is Colette Pinchon-Battle, climate justice activist and human rights lawyer in the southeast of the United States, and she's pointed out that it's a symptom of an economic system that's extractive, exploitative, we're concentrating wealth and power, continuing to do that, and all these other symptoms that we're grappling with, biodiversity loss, mental health, substance abuse, land degradation, health disparities, violence, it's all related to the core challenge of this economic system that's extractive and exploitative. So I've been working on climate and energy issues my whole career, so for 30 years, and I've gotten more and more kind of macro, and this is kind of where I am now, and I really think narrow conversations about technical fixes like this are important to be having, but I think we have to really be very, very careful with who's talking about this and why. And here we are in Harvard, which is an institution that is, the pinnacle and a central role in the system of concentrating wealth and power. So I just want to acknowledge that. And my perspective and a book I wrote in 2020 is Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And in that book, I talked to so many creative, amazing, innovative people who are doing so much work on climate and other social justice issues. And those people are not represented here. And I think there's so much we can all learn from a lot of innovative things that are happening. So one suggestion is that we not have a climate isolationism lens, which I think we do here in Harvard. Definitely this solar geoengineering whole discussion is just saying climate is the problem. So how can we solve that or address that? And climate isolationism, I suggest, is a narrow technocratic lens. It's based on masculine colonial ideas of domination and control. It has this technological optimism that's unrealistic. It perpetuates exploitative economies, and it misses opportunities for investing in people and communities. So I suggest we get rid of the climate isolationism lens and center all of our work on social justice, economic justice, climate justice, focus on investing in people and communities, base those investments on human dignity and basic needs, put people first, what do people need, distribute power literally and figuratively rather than continuing to perpetuate concentration of wealth and power, and leverage the urgency of the climate crisis for larger transformation in society. And so, I think we have, this is possible. You might think I'm being naive or idealistic, but I think we have no choice other than to try to be working toward centering these kinds of principles and ideas. So I think I encourage all of us to try to take a transformative lens. We can't do incremental change anymore. It's insufficient. We know we've had 30 years of trying to address the climate crisis. If we keep trying using the same old approaches, we're not going to make progress, right? We know that. So we need to try different approaches. And I think embracing a transformative lens is critical. We need to honor people and the planet and resist extractive power dynamics. So we really need to be self-reflective on our own work, our own engagement, and embrace feminist, decolonial, anti-racist principles. And what all of that means is just being aware of the power dynamics, the problematics, policies, practices, and priorities that continue to perpetuate wealth and power among some and disadvantage and marginalize others. So that needs to be central to everything we're doing. We need for more research and action that resists imperialism, racism, misogyny, transphobia, and this is where the non-use agreement comes in, we need to resist research that reinforces these systems. And I think that is what solar geoengineering does. And so I don't think you can be neutral. And that's why I am a strong endorsement of the solar geoengineering non-use agreement, and I welcome all of you to consider that too. There is no neutrality here. You're either reinforcing or you're resisting, and we all have a choice. So I've written quite a bit about the dangers of solar geoengineering research. Some of my colleagues are here, Kevin, and Kevin's actually speaking this afternoon, so stay around for a great talk later. I guess I will also just say this is a topic that I don't want to be here. I actually don't want to be talking about this. I have a lot of other research agenda on climate justice and really innovative, amazing work I want to be doing, but this keeps coming up, and it's coming up more and more, and I wish it didn't, but here I am. So I think it's important, and I don't think we can just let this go off into the advance in the way it has been doing. So I also just want to mention I've had some high-profile contributions in this space. I co-authored the chapter in Greta Thunberg's climate book about geoengineering. I was on a recent Doha debate about geoengineering. And I think several of you, we've mentioned this already yesterday, we have a top 10 myths of solar geoengineering. And in this document, please help yourself to come up and get them afterwards. This is part of the non-use agreement, a collaborative effort among members of that group. And many of these myths were just mentioned by my fellow panelists. They're claims that are made a lot in the media and a lot in all of these discussions about solar geoengineering, and that we think are really false claims, and we explain why. And I think there really is a power dynamic in the solar geoengineering community, as we know, where there's big philanthropic funding, there's Harvard, there's big push from mostly tech and finance billionaires to push this, and there's very little support for those of us who are trying to resist and bring up some of these fundamental flaws with this approach. So I just want to end by saying this article I wrote with 6 of my students at Northeastern University. We just got the proofs last night. It'll be published in the next couple days. It is about paradigm shift, and I propose that we all have opportunities to center our work in academia on climate justice. And it's not what we're doing right now, and I think higher ed and our experience and our resources were under-leveraged for actually contributing to the transformative changes that are needed in society. And I wish instead of this conference on solar geoengineering at Harvard, we had a conference on climate justice and fossil fuel phase out, and we were all brainstorming about how to advance that agenda, but we don't, but here we are. So I also want to put forward, this is part of a figure in that paper that's about to be published. We propose there are kind of like 3 strands of climate policy. This is very simplistic, and you can argue against this potentially, but before the 2000s, there was a lot of climate denial, and we don't know if it's real, but okay, it's real, so we'll just put money into research. So there's a lot of climate science research. That was the main climate policy before the 2000s. Then we have climate isolationism policies that are just about climate. These market-based approaches, and then investment in technology innovation. And that's kind of where the solar geoengineering fits in. But many of us are now part of the next generation of climate policy, and that this is investment in climate justice and transformation, and investing in people, investing in communities, investing in education, investing in health, investing in housing. These are climate justice issues, and that is where I think we should be spending more of our time in this next generation of climate policy. So I will end there, I think, just acknowledging that I think there's a real need, societal need, to resist solar geoengineering, and that's what some of us are here doing, and standing in allyship with others who are also, including the Indigenous peoples who wrote the letter to Harvard asking them to stop the ScopeX experiment. And again, just putting forth, if we put climate justice as our guiding principle in academia, we would be doing different kind of research. So I hope we can do that. And I'll also mention like a feminist resistance perspective in terms of being a scholar activist. We, again, all of us, even philosophers, there are impacts, real impacts of what we study and how we're engaging in the political sphere. None of our work is apolitical. There's no such thing. So I think we all have opportunities to use our position and our leverage and our privilege for advocating for systems change and engaging with innovative social and economic opportunities, resisting fossil fuel and corporate interests. The fossil fuel industry in the United States just had their largest profit, 2022, billions. And like, why is that okay? Why are we allowing that? Like, it's not good for anybody except for, a few who, but we seem to just have a complacency about that. And so I think that is all I will say. And I'll just say, acknowledge a lot of my colleagues and students. Thank you.
So I want to thank all our panelists. So I'll probably spend maybe about 10 minutes or so prompting some conversation between you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I thought to start out with just kind of taking some threads from each of the things that you were mentioning. So Annie, in your talk, you help to put legitimacy constraints, and I'll focus particularly on research because I think that's something that's coming up in some of these conversations. And so one of the legitimacy constraints on continuing research is that it's going to coincide with also institutional development for governance. And then Deborah, you were mentioning, of course, that solutions that are often proposed external to communities, particularly sort of with the underlying assumption that Indigenous communities don't already have particular kinds of solutions or institutional frameworks or governance mechanisms that would address these problems, I think is something salient because Annie's putting a framework together or proposes a particular kind of institutional framework that can try to amplify or at least be inclusive of these different perspectives. So, and then Jenny, you're mentioning that we should be focusing climate justice-based considerations in the context of our conversations about this. And so one thing I wanted to kind of pose for all of you to respond, bringing these three different specific pieces together of what you mentioned in the talk, is that it seems like the questions about looking at legitimacy of research, looking at governance mechanisms and the construction of those institutions are themselves a climate justice project. So insofar as addressing solar geo and the challenges it raises, we are looking at more general questions of climate justice. So I just wanted to kind of throw out there an opportunity to respond, perhaps Deborah, to look at some of the proposals that Annie has put forward about these kinds of legitimacy constraints about research, and Jenny to see if that addresses some of the concern that you said about it really being about resistance versus reinforcement, whether you think that climate justice focus is it's inherently reinforcement, because it seems like it is addressing to some extent looking at constraints and centralizing climate justice in those considerations. So any of you can kind of take that up, but I wanted to bring those three threads together. And you can just, anyone can start.
Go ahead.
I'll say something.
Yeah.
I do. I think there's two ways we could think about climate justice. One is requirements of sort of procedural and recognitional justice in the process of making major decisions about climate. And I think one thread that ran through all three presentations is that the way major decisions about funding, about research, and about what we should do, the way those things are being framed right now is insufficiently inclusive and representative of the diversity of perspectives on this issue that there are. And so I do think that's a strand of climate justice, for sure. Yeah.
I guess what came to mind, I mean, I agree, I think we're all agreeing that governance or lack of governance, or if there is something called governance, is not very transparent or effective, is it's whatever is now is not working. And so you need to imagine something or some things at different scales that will. So I don't necessarily have the answer to that. That's the advantage, I think, of being a researcher. Like, we can ask the questions and go out and chat with people and then kind of see what they say. I mean, a lot of my work is Indigenous governance and law, because I don't think the laws are working either. So we need other ones. And so what it made me think of, particularly the example with Sami and what I see in the north. I mean, I teach Indigenous research, so that's sort of the lens that I come at this with, is a lot of people, and it still happens, go do the scientific research on Indigenous lands and territories without talking to Indigenous peoples at all, because it doesn't get triggered through human ethics, through our institutions, or in Canada anyway. What gets triggered is the human part. If I'm going to go talk to someone, that gets triggered. But people are traipsing all over the place, doing all kinds of things, and people in the communities have no idea what's going on unless someone bothers to tell them. So, so that really bugs me, being on the REB community, because there's no hook for us to get people to bother to talk to people who are going to be impacted by their experiments. So even though it's still research at this point, to me there's still an impact, and people have no idea what that is. And when you're confronted with it after the fact, you're not pleased, even if it's a good idea. Like, I'm not saying this is, but I'm saying it could be anything, right? The other part of it, and this is the things I was thinking about as I was listening yesterday, is this technology is being benefit, and I think probably everyone in the room agrees that some people are going to benefit and not others, and we kind of know who the not others are going to benefit are going to be. And then maybe people want to come in and kind of sell the benefit to communities, but communities don't get to define what that benefit is. Other people are. That's also kind of been we have to check that off in our ethics, right? So this is going to be the benefit to the scholarly community. What's going to be the benefit to the community, either immediate or into the future? So, but they don't get to say what that is. Like, we're doing that unless you have a collaborative already partnership to begin with, and you're working through that with people. You're co-developing that research agenda. You're going to co-develop knowledge. That's all the rage, apparently, theoretically, in Indigenous research in Canada. Then they're not getting to decide what that benefit is. Other people are. So again, you still have that, I just call it development perspective. So those are also problematic in terms of how research is governed through universities, as well as what tends to get funded. Like I talked about before, people think about what tends to get funded and what doesn't get funded. And the work that I did when I was trying to do these assessments, it was really, really hard to find the work from an Indigenous perspective. A lot of it was people swooping in and doing research on Indigenous people and interpreting and analyzing in bizarre ways and conclusions that I just want to guess this is a conclusion. So it was really hard to find that. I mean, there is some, I think, increasingly so, but it was actually really hard to do that, to suss that out, to really try to tell a story that I thought could maybe have an impact. So I think how we approach research is critical, and it probably shouldn't be supporting a status quo that we know isn't working or being as imaginative as it could be about solutions. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I guess I was just going to connect in both what Annie and Deborah said in a way that Annie was mentioning that if we do research, we have to assume deployment, right? So we have to prepare for deployment and have a governance structure. And that's what we many of us think, isn't really plausible, that could be established. And that's where I think, and there seems to be somewhat of a consensus about that, like among people who are advocating for solar geoengineering research. But I think what Deborah mentioned, an arrogance that I wanted to come back to, because there does seem to be this kind of assumption of hierarchies of knowledge, right? The people who have the power and the funding, and their knowledge is somehow more
Credible,
legitimate than other people's knowledge, and the effect. And I've done work, social science research on carbon capture and storage, as well as another technological approach to climate change. And a lot of the social science research that got funded was literally to study public acceptance so that we could try to get people to accept it. Like, that was the goal of the social science research. So I just want to be cautious to social scientists that you can get in that you may not realize you're contributing to endorsing and trying to get people to accept the technology that you're studying. But that's what I found myself in that situation when I did social science research on carbon capture and storage. And once I figured that out, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to accept, there's so much funding for carbon capture and storage, social science, public acceptance research, but I don't want to do that anymore. And so I just put that out there as a caution and trying to connect a couple of the different thoughts.